one of the extraordinary privileges you get in running a center here at Stanford is to be able to identify fabulous opportunities for recruitment. Doesn't happen very often, but this year we did have an incredible niche opportunity, possibly related to the events of last November, who's to say, but we did become aware through many colleagues who had worked with Amy that she was potentially looking for an opportunity to leave Census, where she has had a huge impact on their administrative data scene, including our federal statistical research data centers. Amy is was a senior economist at Census. She did her graduate training in economics at Notre Dame. That's next week's football game. We can talk about that one. Not so serious. And Amy joined us several months ago and has taken a major lead in our ability to handle various forms of highly secure administrative data, which she has, again, vast experience within government in doing. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. O'Hara. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to be describing some of the work that I had done at the Census Bureau and how it turns into the work that I'm doing here at Stanford. There's a lot of overlap, and although the title of the talk is Federal Statistical Research Data Center, it's really about data. So a little bit about what I'm going to cover is my former role at Census, and then specifically the administrative data that I helped bring into that agency, and then how people can get access to it through the FSRDC, which is a set of enclaves, and there's one of them here on campus. In the FSRDC, you can get access to the census data that I'll describe, but also to other agency data. So that's information from the National Center for Health Statistics, or from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or from Housing and Urban Development. And then I'm going to end with how you can proceed, how you can actually propose and get approved to use these sorts of data. So when I was at the Census Bureau, I was to build the infrastructure to get data from federal agencies, state agencies, third-party people who sell the data that they've collected about you, and to bring it into the agency legally. That's really important because people want to understand how their data are being used. We also wanted to curate that information to make sure it was well documented so that other people would be able to use it. That's improving the efficiency to be able to reuse these data. That middle box, that's really hard a lot of the time, doing the data linkage. So most of the work I was doing was linking at the person level, sometimes linking at the address level. But doing person-level linkages, especially as the previous two panels have described, it can get really hairy. So you have some consent issues, you have some data quality issues, and for the 1940 census, it's amazing that they were able to link it because it didn't even collect the full date of birth. So understanding the shortcomings of the data sets that you're going to be working with and the different methodologies that you need to apply to do a robust linkage so that you'll want to trust the information that comes out of it is really important. Also in that center box is data access. So once you have these data, they're kind of radioactive. You want to make sure that they're hard to get to but not impossible. So how do you have that information shared among people who are qualified to get it and in a way that it doesn't have spillage so that it's a very secure situation? And that enables the analysis and the dissemination and also the way that you can archive that information so that it can be reused in the future. So what administrative data sources was I working on when I was at Census? As you can see in the first column, lots of federal data. So when I was there, it was my job to lead a team that got all of your tax data every year, to get all of the Medicaid, all of the Medicare, all of the HUD data, all of the Social Security applications, and to bring that in and figure out how to curate it, how to harmonize it, and how to use it. We were also going state by state to get information on food security programs and on welfare and other human services programs. And to do that, you had to engage the lawyers and the technology people and the privacy officials at all of these different states. And so that was much more difficult, or at least more onerous, than going to a federal agency where it was more like one-stop shopping. The third column there, the commercial data, this is the information that has been collected about you that the companies are selling. So working at a statistical agency, That was really tricky data because we had to try to understand its quality, its coverage, its volatility over time, and whether it was worth the risk. Was that company that you were buying the data from going to change the pricing or change the content over time? And so that's really important whenever you're trying to produce statistics about the nation's population. Now in the corner there, I've given the high-level description of some of the agencies and places we've gotten data from, but there is more information about the data inventory itself. It's very small on this slide. It's slightly larger on this slide. And so this gives you an example for all of these different places we got data. There is some minimal metadata online where the Census Bureau tells you the data type and the years available. And they are currently working on ways to get more information about the content of these files. Now these slides are going to be made available, and at the top of the page there is a link so that you can see this in much larger font, as well as the additional pages that are behind it about the administrative data that the Census Bureau has been drawing together. So I told you a minute ago that I was in charge of getting your tax data and all of these other federal agency data, and you may ask yourself, why was she doing that? It's not the National Security Agency. Why was the Census Bureau doing that? Because the agency's mission is to measure the population and economy. And to do so, the Census Bureau has really broad legal authority to seek this information and bring it in because they're only using it for statistical purposes. Statistical purposes means that it is not going to affect the provision of benefit or the actions taken to any individual. And so that is somewhat different from what you heard in our first panel where they were talking about clinical use, interventions, ways to affect the treatment plan for the individuals in the data. So bear that in mind that whenever you're looking at using the RDC, this is for statistical use only, and it's only going to be data in the aggregate, and there are going to be very specific terms to get access to that rich trove of data that was on the previous slide. So lower on this page here, it has a couple of important little sections of the Census Bureau's law. The first is Section 6, that's the Census Bureau's authority to get data and pull it all together. The next is Section 8, which is the Census Bureau's ability to send money out or bring money in, meaning that they can do a lot of really interesting joint projects like the ones that David and Jonathan and Nick have been involved in. The third one there is super important. Section 9 is the confidentiality provision for the Census Act. That means that when the data come in, they cannot be released in an identifiable form so that the information on the subjects in the data are completely protected. And then the final point there, that Census has the ability to swear people in. So if you're a researcher, you can go to the Census Bureau, apply to use these data, and you can be treated as an unpaid employee of the agency so that you can get access to these data. So with the information that Census has pulled in from the federal agencies and the state agencies, these are some ideas of how this group could seek to use these data. You could either focus on matching people, so you could look at the changes in policies or programs or cross-program participation. You could match at the address level so that you could look at the way that certain neighborhoods are affected by foreclosure or rent prices. You could look at zoning changes, or you could be looking at groups of people. And by groups, this is on the right-hand side there, I mean like veterans or children or immigrants or people who are justice involved. The beauty of doing linkage is that it doesn't just have to be about the individual themselves. As we've heard, it's important to be linking across generations, to be seeing what's happening in the household of people who are justice involved or looking at the previous generation or the post-generation. So the Census Bureau had been looking at how to do these broad-scale linkages. They too have linked back to the 1940 census, but they've done it at scale. So matching the 1940 census to the 2000 and the 2010, matching the 2000 to the 2010 is also another project that is, it's got really rich information. You have 150 million people in that link. And so that's the sort of scale that we're talking about here. So I've just described the capacity that the Census Bureau has, and now I want to pivot a bit to the enclaves themselves. The Census Bureau runs these data centers. There are 24 of them now. I believe they're scaling up to 30 in the coming year. And these are secure labs where all of the data from those agencies and from the economic census and the decennial census can be accessed securely. Stanford has one of these. It's over by the golf course on Alta Road. And it's run by an administrator who is a census employee who can help you with your proposal process. And this happens because Census has more data than it can analyze, and you guys have lots of questions that you need data for. And so this is a mutually beneficial relationship. The advantage is that you can get data that are not publicly available. You can get lower geography. You can get these administrative data that are very, very difficult to negotiate access to on your own. You can also get more information than is typically released, which would be the write-ins, say, on some of the surveys. And most importantly, from the work that I used to do, if you show up with a data set, if Mark shows up with the Alcoa data, he would be able to then link it to some of these other sources, because the Census Bureau has the capacity to do this person-level linkage or geocoding and do address-level linkages, and then put that into a workspace for you so that you can conduct your analysis securely. But there's some things that you should know about using the Research Data Center. There is a formal proposal process because these are highly restricted data. You need to get approval from the people who own the data, whether that's the census or some of the other agencies who are hosting their data in this lab structure. You must do background investigations, and so for you or your collaborators or your students, you have to have been in the country 3 years. That's something that Census has been trying to figure out. If you have a first-year graduate student that's only been here a couple of months, it is going to be difficult to get them into the lab, but if they've been here for a longer period of time or if they have a Social Security number, it's going to be far easier. The research must be conducted on site in that lab. There's a restricted room with badge access after you become a Census employee. You can't have internet or phones or anything, so it's kind of a dumb terminal that allows you to tap into the data sources that you've been given approval to use. And then finally, as I pointed out before, the information can only be used for statistical purposes, so all of your results must go through disclosure avoidance review to ensure that it's not going to permit re-identification of any of the subjects. So once you get past all of those hurdles, this is just a laundry list of some of the topics that have been, research has been done in the RDCs. There are data sets that are surveys like the Crime Victimization Survey. There's lots of economic data. There are lots of sources from the National Center for Health Statistics that I'll be getting to in a moment that I think would be really interesting to start exploring and seeing how you could do additional linkages. Some linkages have already been done, such as those to vital records, especially for the NCHS data. This is a really useful slide. Whenever you go to the deck, you can click on this and it will show you examples of projects that have been done. That gives you a sense of what other people have been granted access to, and it also gives you a sense of data sources that researchers have brought in. There's no good way to scroll through these. This network of the research enclaves, it's existed for a couple of decades, and so if I were to go through these papers, it would just scroll and scroll. And that should be really motivating for you because it gives you a sense of the success stories, right? So the top half of the page has to do more with the projects that have used census data, and the bottom half of the page about the data, the research that's been done with the more health-focused data. So the census data, there's economic data, demographic data, and then the third there is the longitudinal employer and household dynamics, so it's like linked employer-employee data. And so think of these as huge frames that you can just interrogate with the questions that you're bringing, and also frames for you to bring your researcher-provided data and to link it with, ideally, at the person level. There have been some projects that we've done where the researchers or the other agencies show up and they have really pristine data to match. It has Social Security number, name, full date of birth, address, and so you're able to pretty easily do a linkage. As Carlos said in the first session, a lot of the problems we face are not going to be technical in nature. There are ways to do these linkages. The shortcoming is when somebody shows up with a data set, such as the grants from a major research university, and all they have is an employee's name and the amount they were paid. Well, that's pretty scant information to do a person-level linkage, and so the Census Bureau has staff that can triangulate to other sources to try to add more linkage keys so you have more attributes to get a high-quality match. So you can take this as the starting point of data sets and figure out what you would be able to bring to bear to answer additional questions. So the data sets that the Census Bureau hosts for the National Center for Health Statistics, there are so many surveys. As I mentioned with the census, you can get the lower level geography. That is also the same here for the NCHS. But the national healthcare surveys that they have granted access to, that it's just a fantastic way. And I believe that of all the projects that are currently active in that set of 24 enclaves, I believe that nearly half of them involve these data sets. And that is a fantastic opportunity if you hadn't been aware of this. I worked really closely with my colleagues at NCHS, and they are fantastic. They have their own linkage group, and they also work really closely with the linkage shop at CMS that has their big data warehouse as well. So there are a lot of opportunities there if you want to look at bringing additional data in to augment the information that was collected. This is page 2 of this. There are lots of already linked files, as you see in the second half of the page there, where they've taken some of the surveys and they've brought in the CMS data, and they can serve that up to you in the secure environment and through the same proposal process that you can go to the RDC here. So the difference between going to Census and going to NCHS, it depends. The data sets are very different, but the Census Bureau can have a much longer period for you to prepare your proposal, and it can also require more iterations, especially if you're looking for use of tax data or Social Security earnings data. There's another difference between the fees that the census proposal process is free, and there is a fee for the proposal process with the NCHS data. And also the scope. With the Census Bureau, you can ask a set of questions and you have a little bit of room to move. And with the NCHS projects, that is somewhat less the case. There are sometimes projects that have a join between the NCHS data and other files that Census has brought in. And so it's kind of the more restrictive census review process would be imposed on that as well. So how would you get started? Here at Stanford, you would approach Emmy Lisher, who is the RDC administrator, and she would be able to tell you more information about the data available in the RDC network. She'd be able to talk to you about your project budget and timeline. The budget comes into play if you wanted to bring any data that might incur cost to be linked, and I've put her email there. And they will help you develop your proposal. It's useful to see other proposals that have come before you, and at the end of my deck here, I have some links that can show you that. When you're using these data, there always has to be a benefit to the census, because remember at the beginning I told you that census has the authority to draw all these data together. Part of the process is that you have to say, this is how the work I am doing is going to help build knowledge about the economy or the population or population health. And so that has to be articulated in your proposal, and that's something that the RDC administrator can help you with. And they will help you navigate that process as well. Now, some of these data sets, there isn't a lot of public-facing information. And so Jonathan and Emmy and I and Vjoy have set up this Slack channel where we're going to try to get a conversation going. One of the questions that Jonathan had asked is, how would I get credit bureau data? Okay. And so I wrote a response to that about who I know who has already gotten credit bureau data and the fact that it's really hard because of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. I expect other people to look at that inventory and say, that looks really interesting. What is the data that you have on New Orleans? You know, and the answer is, post-hurricane, it was information about the level of damage. Now, that's just this little niche file that it was very useful to FEMA at the time that Katrina happened, but it may have enormous research value moving ahead if you could see the people that had been located in areas that were more severely affected as opposed to less severely affected and be able to do longitudinal linkages. So I invite you to go through links like these that will show you examples of proposals. They will go into far more detail about those health surveys from NCHS that I had only listed there. And it will give you examples of FAQs of people who have come to use the RDCs in the past. There's a lot of bureaucracy. At the Census Bureau, that's what they are. They're a bureaucracy. But I don't want that to intimidate you. If you plan your research in advance and you know that you're investing because you want to get data that nobody else has, it is really the best way to do it. And when you're in the data, you can answer questions that had been previously unaddressed. The panel before me, they talked about some of the questions that they had brought to the data. I was stunned when I was at Census that we understood who was participating in the Earned Income Tax Credit, and separately we understood who was participating in SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps. But nobody knew who was participating in both. The fact that at this stage in the game, and this was during the recession, at this stage in the game, we don't know these very basic answers to who is eligible for and participating in these programs that are such important parts of the safety net was stunning. And even more stunning to me was the answer. So I expected to find that people who were eligible for one program and participating were more likely to be participating in the other program, and sadly that was not the case. Seeing the off diagonals there of who was eligible for food stamps but only doing SNAP or who was and vice versa, and then understanding how that varied within a state and across populations, and being able to bring the census data to bear to understand more about English language proficiency or multi-generational households, who is participating and who isn't. It's that sort of investment in getting the linked data. It allowed you to answer questions like that. Similarly, we were looking at the health insurance coverage information that's been collected in the major surveys. Every year, the Census Bureau comes out and talks about the number of Americans that are uninsured. Well, whenever you go in and you look at that and you match it to the data from CMS, and you see the degree of non-response, which we've heard about in the previous panel. So people don't want to tell survey collectors their information. There's so much unit non-response and there's so much item non-response, and administrative data are supposed to sweep in and solve all problems. Well, they can solve many problems, but I always like to say they're not really a gold standard. They're just another source of information that needs to be integrated. And so using the RDC can allow you to be one of kind of the foot soldiers of that revolution as you're figuring out how these data sources complement each other and also where the gaps still remain so that we understand what we're measuring, what we're collecting, and then ultimately how it can affect the populations. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to David, who is going to start our panel.
Thanks very much, Amy. So now I'm going to pose a set of questions to our panelists, who I guess haven't yet been introduced, so let me just briefly do so. Next to Amy is Nick Bloom, and then next to Nick is Jonathan Fisher, and I'm David Grusky. So I'm just going to go right to it, pose the questions, and see what comes out of that. So the first question, and I'll start with Nick and then Jonathan, is how have you used census data and the RDC? Just give us a brief overview of the sorts of projects in which you're involved that use census data and the RDC. And I'll start, as I said, with Nick.
Okay. So I'm a professor in economics. My office is literally 1 minute walk down here. I have a bunch of projects with various grad students. I don't know, how many of you know physically where it is. It's next to the golf course, so that helps. So I go there about once a week. I have graduate students probably I have about 4 or 5 graduate students using the data there. That mostly there's 1 or 2 of them there kind of every day. I have 3, I basically work on what Amy called the economic data. So my research is looking at firms' productivity growth, interacts a bit with health to a moderate extent, not fully. I'll give you like 3 example projects I'm working on just to give you an outline. So the earlier stuff I've been working on that data about a decade. In fact, before Stanford opened up, it used to be Berkeley. So you used to have this long drive over to Berkeley and back, which wasn't entirely satisfactory. I mean, we got stopped by highway patrol once. There was a strike in Berkeley. I mean, the strikes happen more regularly there than they do here. So anyway, I was very happy we have it on campus. I've been looking at uncertainty, so how uncertainty varies over time, looking at the volatility of growth and expansion contractions of individual plants. More recently, I've been looking at management practices. So I've been doing a lot of work. We were talking beforehand, something I did that I don't know if other people are interested in doing is I proposed a survey to the census. So I've been working on management. There's no management data in the census. So we got an outside grant. We raised about $1 million. We basically handed that over to the census, and they've now had 2 waves of a management survey. And in fact, a number of other countries have followed suit. So there's about, the Mexicans have one, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Indians. But one thought is if the data you're looking for isn't there, it's actually possible to get your own data. The census is actually extremely open. If you turn up with money to collecting your own data, and if it is policy relevant. So we looked at management. For example, how does right to work status affect management practices? There's a big political issue that a number of states are becoming right to work, which means they're pro-business, kind of anti-workers, anti-union. How's that affected workers? How's that affected productivity? We've been looking more recently at management inequality, so just got access to the LEHD. So are firms that have aggressive management practices with kind of tough hiring and firing practices more likely to promote inequality? Actually, we're hoping to get access to some health outcomes data to look at, is it the case that well-managed / tough-managed firms have more or less work accidents? You could see it going either way. I've long been talking to Mark about Alcoa on this. And then most recently, a second survey around with the census was getting firms' expectations on the future. So we were, again, talking in the break, one of the interesting things is that the Census Bureau in general is under a lot of pressure from in Washington over its budget, and particularly the critique that, hey, look, there's all this administrative data, there's Google's data, there's all the online data. Why on earth do we need the Census Bureau? We can get all the data for free from somewhere else without pestering people with surveys. And so one of the things they're very open to is types of surveys that actually collect data that doesn't exist anywhere else. So it's one of the reasons why the management work was interesting. There's no administrative or online data management. We've also been getting expectations data. We're trying to look at how businesses form expectations, how accurate they are. The answer is not all of them can form them, not all of them are very accurate. This is also related to what Amy said, current research, so a lot of the results aren't security cleared. So I can't tell you what they are, but when you come back to working with census data, another issue that is I'd say less good, more bad, is that you have these results. I've been spending a year working on this stuff. We haven't security cleared it, so it's very frustrating. I can't tell people what it's about. Even co-authors that aren't special sworn status, since they aren't security cleared, I can't share with them more than just verbal discussions. But on the other hand, the data is amazing. It's why I bike up to the golf course or next door to it once every week. So those are my projects.
Great, thanks very much. Jonathan, what are you working on?
Thanks, David. I have 2 projects in the RDC right now. One is, as Amy said, bringing in external data. The Census Bureau does not collect anything on personal bankruptcy filings, so consumer bankruptcies, but they are public information. So I brought in about 20 million personal bankruptcy records, downloaded from a different government website, and had it linked. Those records had name, address at the time they filed for bankruptcy, and the last 4 digits of their social security number, and at the time when Amy was there, the part she worked in linked this and gave me a linkage key so I could link it to other Census Bureau data. And because Census Bureau does not collect personal bankruptcy information, and no government agency does, the first paper was just who files for personal bankruptcy. It is actually middle-income people. And it's people who have around median income, and it's important as well because it's about a transfer of about $50 billion in debt forgiven each year. So $50 billion in debt is forgiven in consumer bankruptcy in 2015. So this is a big transfer of income. So understanding who is receiving this transfer was important. Then a second paper on that was if you is living next to someone who filed for bankruptcy make you more likely to file for bankruptcy? So I found, and as opposed to Nick, I've released the results, so I can tell you what the result is. If you someone who filed for bankruptcy in a different state moved into your census block, and so this is a very small area, is probably about your closest 30 neighbors. If someone moved into your census block, it increased your likelihood of filing for bankruptcy by about 10%. And I think this is really just who files for bankruptcy, or bankruptcy is not well understood, and so having someone who moves into your neighborhood, you talk to them, you really understand the benefits and potential costs of filing for bankruptcy. Then there's a second project that is joint with David, and we are looking at intergenerational mobility. So a big question today is, are children doing as well or worse off or better off than their parents? And so we're looking at occupational mobility. So we're taking children who were born between 1983 and 1989. We see them living with their parents in the 2000 decennial. So we see what their parents' education, occupation, income was in the 2000 decennial. Then we find those same kids as adults when they're in the American Community Survey, so when they're about 24 to 32 years old. So we see the kids' education, occupation, income. And then we compare education, we're focusing on occupation right now, comparing parents' occupation to children's occupation. And there's a large literature that does this, but they have often sample sizes in the hundreds, if they're lucky, in the low thousands. With this, we have over 100,000 sons and 100,000 daughters who we see living with the parents and as adults. And the one big innovation that we're working on right now is just looking at differences in race. Often in this literature, they look at differences possibly between white and black and white or Hispanic. Here we can compare white versus Hispanic who identify as their ancestry is from Mexico. Ancestry is instead from Cuba. We can also do these things for Asian countries. So we're looking at much more detailed racial and ethnic background than we could in previous research. So those are the two projects right now.
Thanks very much. If I could just add a bit, we can't talk again about the results from that last project that Jonathan just conveyed, but I guess I can say that they're of great interest. The only other point that I'd add by way of embellishment is that these sorts of data also allow for a host of other empirical studies that I think will allow us to better understand social mobility in the U.S. So, for example, we can combine the very recent data that Jonathan just described and compare the occupational mobility that prevails in those recent data as against results from earlier surveys, and thereby examine trends, long-run trends in occupational mobility in the U.S. We can also examine the extent to which mothers and fathers are affecting the career trajectories of their children, something that has to date been very difficult to ascertain because we simply didn't have enough cases to allow us to distinguish the net effects of mothers and fathers. But there are lots of reasons to believe that as women increasingly enter into the labor force, it's going to change that mobility process in ways that are rather consequential. And we can examine that with the sorts of data that Jonathan just described. Okay, next question. Part of the lore of working with the Census Bureau and working in a research data center is that there'll be lots of delays, lots of obstacles. It's a very time-consuming process. And that might lead to a bit of pain. So I want to ask those folks who have actually done this and ask to what extent they've encountered obstacles and delays. Is that stereotype that this is a very obstacle-ridden process? Is that stereotype on the mark, or is it overstated? So I'll start again with Nick.
So it's definitely a painful process. I'll go through a series of painful steps. On the other hand, I have a number of grad students that I advise in co-authors I work with, and actually I always encourage them to apply to the census because there are certain data sets you can download, like the CPS. You can download it for free easily. It's very straightforward. I've used it a lot of PSID. On the other hand, thousands of other people have downloaded it. So like every regression you're going to run, or every tab has been done many times, backward, forwards, often with different numbers and different results. So the census, on the other hand, I kind of describe it like your grandmother's attic. You've no idea what's in there, but you'll find some amazing things. So one of the upsides is you can write these project descriptions, but they're not watertight. So as Amy said, they try and get you to focus on topics, but you want to write as broad a project description as you can. And what that allows you is once the project gets up and running, you don't just have your initial hypothesis. Imagine if you wanted to look at the impact of, I don't know, say in my case, management practices on health and safety of serious accidents. You may just frame it more generally of, working conditions, competition, industry relationships. And then if you found nothing of management, you found something of the impact of Chinese trade competition on industrial deaths, which would, hit the front pages of the New York Times if you could release it, would be a great result. And you may not have that idea going in because no one else has access to the census. No one else probably have written that until now. So before I start being really negative, I want to say, my actions speak louder than words in the sense I have many projects going on. But in terms of just physically the downsides, it takes about 1.5 years to 2 years from a standing start. So the two main steps you have to do is, one is you have to get your project approved. So you have to write up a project, has to go to the Census Economic Service. They have to go through various steps, and they're happy with the economic rationale of it. So it's a serious research piece. It then goes to the IRS, who then have to show that it matches, I think, Title 13. It has serious benefits to the census. That whole process can take a year if your draft is ready. So if you're very efficient and fast, it's probably about 1 year, maybe 1.5 years. After that, if you don't already have Special Swan status, you have to get Special Swan status, which means somebody will come and interview you, they'll ask a whole boat of invasive questions, you have to provide references. I once forgot, the only time I did this, I forgot to tell I assume they never actually contacted the referees to check who they are. So I just gave them some names of people and never bothered to tell them. And one of them is my friend in New York, who his wife has a kind of dubious immigration status. And this big letter came through from, government with this massive crest. It was like the immigration service, and the guy panicked and was about to leave the country until he opened it up and discovered it was a reference letter for me. So it's a very serious process. So that takes another 6 months. So you're looking at up to 2 years. That's one problem. Another issue is it was raised, you have to have 3 years residence. I've had a couple of grad students that can't make it. So you've not been a resident in the US for 3 years. And then finally, that's a bit of a pain. It has its upsides, which is you have to use it in the RDC, which is currently up near the golf course. Now, it's actually, Iris is a fantastic location. I actually quite enjoy going up there. It's serene and peaceful, and you see wild turkeys wandering around. But on the other hand, you can't share the data with other people, and you can't clear it out. So I work a lot with, for example, a co-author in MIT, and it's really frustrating that I can't show John my tables of results. I have to kind of vaguely talk about it. So in a dream world, all your co-authors have got Special Swan status. There's RDCs all around the country. So often I have these phone calls. We have them kind of 2 or 3 times a month, actually, where he'll be in the Boston RDC, I'll be in here, maybe Lucia's in the Washington RDC. We're all looking at the same figures on the computer screen. As long as you can set that up, that gets around most of it. So I would say high cost, but very high benefits. At least in economics, there's been a number of extremely high impact papers have come out that have had lots of coverage. And I've had a bunch of coverage in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, for example, from papers coming out of the census. There's no way you could do that without it, but it is a painful process. So it's worth thinking seriously if you want to go through it.
Thanks, Nick. Jonathan, war stories.
Yes, well, I'll say before coming here, I was a Census Bureau employee and went through, even as a Census Bureau employee, I had to go through the same proposal process, and it still took just as long. So it's not something Census is doing just to external researchers. It's just a process they have to go through on all research projects. So that was my personal war story of even within Census Bureau, it still took over 12 months just to get the proposal approved. But one bit of note that Amy mentioned that I also wanted to mention is Nick, in the business data he's using, it comes from the IRS. And so that requires IRS approval. If you're using the health data, the National Center for Health Statistics, you don't need IRS approval. Those review times are less and don't take as long. Still take a long time. It's still not tomorrow. You still need to go through the background check, which again can take 3 to 6 months. So even with the health data sets, I would still say it would be 9 to 12 months is at least what I'd expect before you could get in. And then if you use Census Bureau data sets that are about households that don't have any tax data, then it only requires a census approval. And there, again, I would say 12 to 18 months to get in, right? Because you don't have that extra step of having to go to the IRS, which adds uncertainty. So there are definitely issues, but yes, again, revealed preference is Nick and I are up here, and David and Amy, we've all used the data because there are great benefits, but there are the costs to it as well.
David, can I jump in?
Okay.
In the past couple of weeks, a bill was dropped. It's HR 4174. Paul Ryan, 2 years ago, had proposed that there be a commission for evidence-based policymaking. And that commission met for about 1.5 years, and they released a report in September. And part of what their report noted is that while it is important to have a set of enclaves that could be used to access restricted data, including administrative data, the current way that that is happening could be improved. And so this bill is proposing to set up an advisory committee looking at ways to improve the way that data are accessed and, you know, potentially getting more enclaves around the country or more modes of data access, but also to clarify and streamline what it means to be a qualified researcher across the entire system. And so there was recognition that this could be improved, and the bill has already passed the House. It is attached to an Open Data Act, so it may actually move. And that would mean that there would be at least congressional attention to getting better researcher access to these important data because they can inform policymakers.
Great, thanks. Okay, last question. And it's a very simple one, and it'll go again to Nick and Jonathan, and it's as follows. If you had to do it all over again, would you indeed have embarked on your census projects? Were they worth it? And if they were, why? And so here the question is taking full account of the opportunity cost, imagining how you could have otherwise spent your time, the projects that were foregone by virtue of having undertaken the census projects. Was it a wise decision on your part?
Yeah, for me, yes. And I think for my grad students, yeah. I mean, I work a lot. I know people have very different modes. I work a lot with graduate students, almost all my papers with them. The costs are huge, and it is slow, but on the other hand, the data there is fantastic. I mean, Jonathan and David saying on their project, you go from cells of, you know, hundreds to hundreds of thousands. If you're looking at, you know, the LEHD has 50 million people. So, for example, take a question. So all of us have worked on inequality. So I've been looking at firms inequality, and firms appear to be, it's not clear they're a driver of, they're highly correlative. So 2/3 of the increase in inequality is between firms. So it's not like everyone within Stanford's becoming more unequal. It's that Stanford and Harvard, for example, are paying a lot more than other universities, and that gap has got dramatically wider. So then the question is, why is that? And we're not really sure. We're honestly not really sure. And one argument might be something to do with corporate governance or management practices or competition. But in order to answer any of these questions, you just need massive data sets, in part because inequality is a second moment. It's kind of a spread rather than a mean. And you need to look at differences across subsamples. So right now I'm looking at the LEHD, which has workers and firms that has, you know, 50 million people a year. You just could never answer that. So it's partly why I said the costs are high and the benefits are high. If your aim is to put out, you know, a blog piece, I wouldn't advise going into the census. It's just not worth it. If your aim is to put out a serious academic publication or something that will have big impact, and you're prepared to wait 2, 3, 4 years, it's a great idea, because certainly over a 4-year horizon, it's, you know, great data makes it a lot easier to do everything else. So if you have fantastic data, you don't actually have to work very hard on everything else. You can do basic analysis. Your English can be terrible. Your presentational skills can be awful. You can still get away with a big smash, whereas if you have terrible data, it's very hard to make up for the rest of it. I guess it's like marketing in your product. You don't need to market a great product very well. But it's the same thing with the census.
Thank you very much. Okay, Jonathan, again, the counterfactual. Imagining what would have happened had you not undertaken the census projects, would you have done better work having not embarked on it? Or are you convinced that it was a smart and wise move on your part?
I'm convinced. So I did my dissertation on personal bankruptcy, in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I mined the same 500 people that filed for bankruptcy in the panel study of income dynamics in 1996, and did that for a few years, and I actually stopped doing research on bankruptcy until I was able to get access to this administrative data, and it was just something that it's not possible to do in any other data set, and so it was. I had lots of research questions. I just couldn't justify doing, using those same 500 people over and over, and it got older and older because it was always relative to it was always from bankruptcy filers from the mid 1990s. And so, absolutely, that it's just the data that I could not access otherwise. If this hadn't come along, I would have continued doing other research and would not have gotten back into the research on consumer bankruptcy.
Thank you. I would like to propose, but correct me, Amy or Mark, if I'm wrong, to propose that there be questions from the floor. Great, so I think maybe you can come up with better questions and more important questions than I can, and so I'd love to just move right to the floor and take advantage of this distinguished panel.
Hi, this was a great panel. So one of the hats I also wear is connected to open science movements. And in that respect, econ has an intriguing state right now, right? Because like a top econ journal like AER, 2/3 of the papers or so, empirical papers or so, the data and the code are available, and the idea is econ is doing very important work, and as a result, you shouldn't have to trust us here, you can reproduce this yourself. Right? And then the other 1/3 are exempted, and a lot of it is data that you talk about there, where the data, it's something where it's a very important question. This is why you're able to get the approval to begin with, but there's a lot of trust in the analysts and that they're doing things right. Do you see there being, like, if we think 10 to 20 years out, do you think that that's going to sort of still be the case, or do you think that there's some solution to that issue where somebody can be doing very private and sensitive work, but the results of the process can be more open than what it is now?
Okay. I think that we are heading toward the area where it is going to support the rediscovery, the reuse of these data. I think that attaching a persistent identifier to the data sets is going to be driving data citation more than we've seen picked up anywhere. And that's going to be driven by the placement of AEA hiring a data editor, for instance. I think the administrative data that we've been discussing that's available at the Census Bureau through this RDC network, that's one bundle, but then separately, a lot of the papers that are in your 1/3 there are access to proprietary data. And I think that that's a very different animal than the government administrative data that we've been talking about. There are discussions underway. Part of the work that I do with Mark is funded by the Sloan Foundation, and we're specifically looking into some of these issues of how you could have better discoverability of the data to be used, and also supporting open science. So that is something that's in work right now, and I think that the solutions involving the government data, again, are going to be easier to come to rather than the purely proprietary data that many of our colleagues use.
I was going to say, it's not clear the census is actually any worse. So just as backdrop, there's various scandals of non-replication, and it's important to have replication and results that turn out to look suspicious and probably were. The census actually, because the security clearance, actually has something that's very helpful, which is in order to make sure you're not clearing like results of a one-person cell. So here's things that is more complicated than it seems. I clear the averages of 10 people's income. I clear another number, the averages of 9 people's income. But it's pretty easy to impute who the 10th person was that's been dropped. So they go through some careful procedures. What that means is you have to provide your code, and it has to be sent to someone in the census that runs the code through. And it also has to be stored, which is a huge upside, because you can't do naughty things of dropping, this person because they don't make the numbers look right, because somebody else is going to check the numbers after you. So actually, in many ways, I trust numbers that come out of the census. As Amy said, the proprietary stuff where people have used, mint.com or whatever, Twitter, who knows what's been gone on. But with the census, a second pair of eyes has looked over it, and some other research can come 5 years later, and the code is all stored there because of federal regulations. So actually, in many ways, it's in some ways actually better than the other 2/3 for the census part. The problem is the private survey I've run. I mean, the worst cases have been private surveys people have run, and then they refuse to share the results, claiming confidentiality. So I agree it's an issue. I'm on the AA committee, and we're discussing this issue very actively. And I think economics and much of the rest of social science has been afflicted with scandals, and replication is an important part of trying to address them.
But I'd also like to make a point about the 2/3 of the studies that are able to put their data up, because it's typically pointing at public use files, say from the CPS or the ACS. Those surveys having public use files is something that is hotly debated in Washington. Is the mosaic effect now at the point? Have we reached the tipping point where there should not be these public use data sets that enable so many of the graduate students to write these dissertations? And what is the level of noise infusion, and what is the amount of geographic information that can be released? And especially when you're looking at panel surveys, should they have public use files at all, or should they be drawn into the enclave? If they are drawn into the enclave, we better have quicker, easier pathways into the data. If you're not going to have a public use file for the CPS for people to grab and rerun the regression that everyone else has run, you must have a very nimble way for people to get into a secure lab.
If I could make one follow-up as well, because I think this is an immensely important question. It's arguably the question of our time. I would suggest that until these data are more widely available, and I think most of us hope that there will be a moment when they are, but until they're more widely available, those folks who do have access have a special obligation and responsibility to work even harder to provide that sort of replication work that otherwise you'd rely upon the invisible hand of science to provide. And in my experience, the folks who have access to these data are exercising, are playing the game in a way that's consistent with that special normative responsibility. So, for example, in work that I've done with Raj Chetty, there are teams of folks who are going over the data over and over again, replicating within the context of a team. Now, ideally, you'd want the additional replication that arises by virtue of other researchers having access to the data. But in the absence of that, it's not just the kind of review that Nick talks about, but also within the research team, there's a special obligation to go over the analyses time and again to make sure that they stand up. And so that's an extra special normative responsibility that might be understood as part of the cost of having access to these data, but a cost that ought to be, and so far as I know, typically is shouldered.
So to the Raj point, he has access to tax data through a research arrangement with IRS. And when I was at Census, I had access to tax data for statistical purposes pursuant to the Census Act. And so I had 33 social scientists that worked for me, and he had his team of researchers, and we were both using the same IRS returns, basically on all of you. And I knew that at one point we were going to compare notes, and they checked out. And let me tell you, that was a huge relief, not just because it was an indication the good work was being done. From a curator's point of view, it was a relief that IRS had exposed the same data to his research team that they had exposed to the Census Bureau. And something very useful here for replicability is having a consistent set of data that you understand what you're using, so that the follow-on users aren't just getting another custom extract. So having confidence in the underlying data themselves is really important.
More questions?
Let me congratulate this panel. Thank you very much.